JMC 6000 here in the JMC Garage for this week's JMC Garage Talk. And in front of me we have the Jeep Grand Cherokee, but we have in the garage here that I want to look into is the 3.6 Infamous Pentastar V6 by Chrysler, well, now Stellantis. It's still part of the FCA group. But anyway, let's kind of go a little bit of history and background of the 3.6 Pentastar V6, and then we'll kind of go through some of my great. I have a love-hate relationship with this engine, and I'll kind of explain about that here in a little bit. But let's kind of go in the background. So this engine, when it was introduced, Chrysler was coming out of just being acquired by Daimler. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. Daimler already acquired them, but they had to be rescued again by Fiat and everything else. And they were coming out of a tough time around late 2000, early 2010, 2011. And they had some good V6 engines coming out of that. They had the 3.5 high output single rated cam, though that was actually a belt-driven camshaft version of their V6. And they also did a spin-off of that engine, the 4-liter that was used in the Dodge Nitro, that was used in the Grand Caravan, that was used in the Town & Country minivans, and some others. And then they also had their kind of their simpler V6 engines, the 3.8 that was found in the base Wranglers, and that was also found in the Grand. It was also known as their minivan engine, the 3.8 V6. It was an overhead valve found in the Grand Caravans, found in the Town & Countries, and some others. So what Chrysler needed at that time, of course, you know, their partnership with Daimler, they needed a V6 that could take over not only what the 3.8 was doing, but also what the 3.5 high output was doing that was in their LH cars, that was in the LX cars, and everything else. So they needed something that would kind of do a plethora and really come in and be the V6 that would end all V6s for Chrysler. So in development was this gem right here, the 3.6 liter Pentastar V6. It basically took over where the 3.8 overhead valve left off, and also where the 3.5 high output and the 4-liter left off as well. So when this engine debuted, it was a revolutionary engine for Chrysler. I mean, they've never done anything like this before. It is a dual red cam, twin independent variable cam timing of both intake and exhaust, with chain-driven cams that are timing chain driven and not belt driven like it was on the previous 3.5 high output and the 4-liter. And I'm talking about the straight 6 4-liter. That was part of the AMC Jeep way back when. We're not talking about that. We're talking about there was a 4-liter V6 that was based off the 3.5 architecture. Anyway, so Chrysler designed the 3.6 Pentastar. Now, flash forward to today, this engine was introduced right around the 2011-2012 model year, and it debuted in everything, whether it was the Wrangler, the Grand Cherokee, whether it was the Grand Caravan, the Town & Country, the LX cars, the Challenger, the Charger as their base engines, the 300 as their base engine, and even a version went into the Dodge Avenger back then. It was from the Stratus, now it was called the Avenger, and everything in between, and even in the base Ram 1500 pickups. Anything that had an ability to take this engine, Chrysler stuffed it in everything they could. Anything and everything took this engine. So now we have it today. And let me get my flashlight real quick. So one of the things about this engine, why I have a love-hate relationship, I'm going to tell you that right now. So over the course of 12 to 13 years since this engine was introduced, Chrysler hasn't done much to this engine. It's still port injected. It's not direct injected. Chrysler did do a smaller version called the 3.2 that was offered in the Cherokee. But other than that, much of this engine from its basic architecture has not changed in about 13 years. It's basically stayed the same. So that's one of the things that's awesome about this engine, is that it's very simple in its design, and Chrysler hasn't done much to it. Now, the early versions of the 3.6 had problems. They had issues with the heads. A lot of the early versions needed head replacements. And then also the 3.6, especially the early versions, were known for letting roller rockers. This uses roller rockers, and the roller rockers underneath the valve cover actually go kaput, especially if you didn't do the maintenance on these, and these would develop what they call the 3.6 tick. And it was very prevalent on the minivans, very prevalent on even the Wranglers of the early years. Very prevalent that when they're sitting there idling, you just hear them ticking away. And usually one of the roller rockers, if not multiple ones, probably need to be replaced because it would go out. So one of the things about this engine, despite its simplicity and everything in between, there are some known issues about this engine besides the roller rockers, besides the head replacements from early years. Right down here, if you can see that, son, if I can, right there, that's where the oil filter is. And now below that is an oil cooler. Now the oil filter in the housing is all plastic and attaches to an oil cooler that's deep in the valley between the V of this V6. And they're known to leak oil. They're known to leak coolant. It's it's a water to oil intercooler. And it's known to have issues, and they're known to go out as well. Kind of an expensive fix because everything in this top end has to come off in order to replace that oil cooler when it goes out. So that's another issue with this V6. Love-hate relationship. I love the simplicity of this engine. Now, it doesn't look very simplistic here in its latest iteration. You can still see, if we were to take this out of the way, which we're not going to do, but if we were to take this out of the way, you can see some of the coils on this side to get to the spark plugs. On this side here, this upper intake has to be removed, like on most modern V6s. Have to remove the upper intake in order to get to this side of the coils. It's not that bad, but what makes it worse is Chrysler has since, or Stellantis has since gone with a cooled EGR system for this V6. So we actually have an EGR system that introduces exhaust gases back into the intake, and they use a coolant type of a system where they actually run engine coolant. They actually cool the EGR gases before it goes back into the intake stream. A lot of modern engines are doing that. That's another thing you have to contend with in order to get this intake off, in order to change this side of spark plugs, if you have to mess with this EGR system right here. It's all electronic. But other than that, what I love is that the basic premise of this engine hasn't really changed. It's still port injected. It's part of the reason why it's not efficient. One of the things I hate about it, but it's still port injected. It's still as far as very basic in its design. There's nothing fancy. There's no turbos. There's nothing crazy going on with this particular engine. It's still pretty basic, and I love that about the 3.6. But some of the downsides to the 3.6, as we talk about it here, is number one. Many people claim this engine is reliable. It's kind of a hit and miss. I think the bones of this V6 are good, like the bottom end, the things that make this V6 stout for what it is are good. But what is the downfall of the 3.6 Pentastar is everything attached to it. The oil cooler, the roller rockers, the intake system, and everything attached to it. And all that Chrysler uses attached to this engine makes this an unreliable engine. Now, I know people are going to argue with me in the comments. Well, I had my 3.6 Pentastar and it's got 200,000 miles. Never had to do anything to it. Well, that's awesome. That's good. And you're one of the lucky few. But there's many out there that these engines, if you don't keep up with the maintenance, it is the downfall because everything else will break around it. And I'm not talking about major engine failure. We don't hear much of major engine failure with the 3.6, and that's one of the things I love about it. But one of the downfalls to this engine is everything breaks down around it. The electronics, the stuff like the oil cooler, some of the roller rocker, everything around it, everything attached to it will start breaking down, even though the engine itself is good, if that makes sense. We don't hear of blown head gaskets on these engines. A lot of the issues you had with the heads in the early years, Chrysler totally took care of, so we don't hear about those anymore. And I don't hear of any timing chain issues with these engines at all. That's a really good incentive for this engine versus like the 3.6 found in the GM triplets. But everything else around it will break down. The electronics and everything else. So again, it's a love-hate. And then the final thing I want to say about the 3.6 Pentastar, and I know people are going to argue with me about this, It was an issue when this engine was first introduced, and the 8-speed and this really helps to neglect or make that issue kind of like not an issue anymore. And that is the lack of low-end power. You have to wrap this engine out in order to get power. It's like nobody's home until it hits about 35, almost 4 grand. And then it's like, okay, we're going to wake up and now we're going to produce power. But it really, this engine really much doesn't have hardly any low-end torque. And in a big vehicle like this, it's evident when you get off the line. And you know, if you're being gentle with it, it's totally awesome. You're not going to notice it, but if you get off the line and you want to get on it, you're going to be like, what in the world? There's like nobody home. And then all of a sudden it kicks you in the pants. It's almost like a turbo. And that's one of the downfalls of this engine. And it was really apparent in the early years of this engine when they backed it up with like the 5-speed automatic from Mercedes. What a horrible combo. Tell you a quick story. I don't know what time we're at right now, but I'll tell you a quick story. I worked at a Chrysler dealership back in Colorado. And usually I was the guy that would transfer vehicles from one dealership to another. So in Colorado, where I was at, I had to go from Alamosa, Colorado, go through the valley and go all the way up to Salida, Colorado. And I had to travel through this big, long stretch valley. If you look on a map, it's hard to describe. But anyway, I could do 70 miles an hour. And I was transferring a 2012 Jeep Wrangler. Had this engine in it, but unfortunately it was a Wrangler Sahara. And it was saddled with that 5-speed Mercedes-Benz automatic. And there was kind of a headwind that day. And we all know the Wrangler is shaped like a brick. And as I was traveling, I had the cruise control set to 70. And it would just settle down. And then all of a sudden it would downshift. As soon as it would get down to about 68, 67, it would downshift. And then it would try to ramp up the power. And then it would go to about 71 and then upshift again. And they'll do that for about, I don't know, 3 minutes, and then it'll downshift again, and it was just having a hard time staying at 70 miles an hour. Now, granted, there was a little bit of a headwind, and we know that the Wranglers do not like headwinds, and it's like a fist in the air, but it was just so annoying, and that happened for like almost a whole trip. I was so annoyed. I was like, this engine has no guts down low, and then once it gets into power, it's almost like, and then it downshifts again, and then upshift and downshift. And granted, in Colorado, it was about 7,000 feet in elevation, so that does take away some power. But it was just so annoying. Praise the Lord, they actually put the 8-speed behind these and actually helped to mitigate that issue. But still, my love-hate relationship is I love its simplistic design. I love that it's still a naturally aspirated V6. And the bones of this V6 are good. But everything around it sucks. Everything around it is junk. And that's the downfall of Stellantis and Chrysler even still, is the electrical problems and everything else. But for what it is, it's a good V6. If you can get around some of the nagging issues that can plague this engine, it's actually a decent engine. Just not much for down low power, so don't expect to be towing a lot with this thing. But anyway, if you guys have any thoughts or comments about the 3.6-liter Pentastar, please put it in the comment section. Love to hear your talk and feedback. I would recommend this engine over the 3.6 found in the GM Trio. So definitely a better engine than that. Not quite up to snuff as Ford's Cyclone engine, which is absolutely an amazing engine. The 3.7, the 3.5, especially in the rear-wheel drive layout. Not so much in the front-wheel drive because you're going to deal with the water pump that's driven by the timing chain. But anyway, besides the point. Guys, drop a comment, like, hit the bell notification. This is what my overall thoughts and feelings and convictions about the 3.6. You guys, let me know your thoughts about this engine. Appreciate you guys, and you be blessed. We'll see you on the next one.